The rain fell like shattered glass against the cobblestones of Nethermore, a city that had learned to hide its secrets beneath layers of fog and whispered prayers. It was the kind of rain that tasted of iron and old regrets, the kind that made even the bravest souls seek shelter before the cathedral bells tolled midnight. But Demon Cross wasn't brave. He was desperate, and desperation had a way of making fools of even the wisest men. He pressed his hand against the wound in his side, feeling the warmth of his own blood seeping through his fingers like sand through an hourglass. Each step sent lightning bolts of agony up his spine, but stopping meant death, and death was something he'd been running from for 3 days straight. The Blackthorn Syndicate didn't forgive debts, and they certainly didn't forgive witnesses. He'd seen what they did to Marcus in that warehouse, the way they'd peeled his friend apart like an overripe fruit, methodical and cruel. Demon had run, and now the hunters were closing in. The cathedral loomed before him like a skeletal giant, its Gothic spires piercing the storm clouds with accusatory fingers. St. Mordecai's had been abandoned for decades, ever since the Great Purge when the church had declared this entire district cursed ground. The stained glass windows were mostly shattered now, leaving jagged teeth of colored glass that caught the lightning in prismatic flashes. Demon had never been a religious man, but tonight he would pray to any god that would listen. He stumbled through the broken doors, leaving a trail of crimson behind him on the dust-covered marble. The interior was a graveyard of forgotten faith, pews overturned and rotting, statues of saints with their faces chiseled away by zealots, and an altar that had been desecrated so thoroughly that even its shape seemed uncertain in the darkness. But it was shelter, and shelter was all he needed. Just a place to catch his breath, to think, to figure out how a bartender from the lower district had ended up bleeding out in a place where even rats feared to tread. He collapsed behind a fallen pillar, his breathing ragged and wet. The wound was worse than he'd thought. Through his torn shirt he could see the knife had gone deep, probably nicked something important. His vision swam and he tasted copper on his tongue. This was it then. This was where Demon Cross's unremarkable life would end. Alone, cold, and forgotten in a church that God himself had abandoned. But the cathedral wasn't as empty as he'd believed. She emerged from the shadows like smoke given form, so silent that for a moment Demon thought she was a hallucination conjured by his dying brain. She wore a gown that seemed woven from midnight itself, fabric that absorbed light rather than reflected it, making her pale skin appear luminous by contrast. Her hair cascaded down her back in waves of silver black, each strand catching the moonlight filtering through the broken windows like threads of spider silk kissed by frost. But it was her eyes that froze the scream in his throat, crimson as fresh blood, glowing with an inner fire that spoke of hunger and ancient power. "You're dying," she said, her voice like velvet dragged across broken glass. It wasn't a question. Demon tried to speak, but all that came out was a strangled cough. Blood flecked his lips. She moved closer, each step perfectly silent, perfectly controlled. She was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen and the most terrifying. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his body had given up on following orders. "The Blackthorn hunters are 2 minutes behind you," she continued, tilting her head with inhuman precision. "They'll find you here. They'll finish what they started. You'll die screaming and your body will be fed to the river by dawn." She paused, studying him with the intensity of a predator deciding whether prey was worth the effort. Or what? He managed to rasp. She knelt beside him, her gown pooling around her like liquid shadow. Up close, he could see that her beauty was too perfect, too symmetrical, the uncanny valley made flesh. Her skin had no pores, no imperfections, as if she'd been carved from marble by an obsessive sculptor. When she smiled, her canines were just slightly too long, too sharp. "Or I save you," she whispered, "and you become the most hunted man in 7 kingdoms." Demon laughed, which was a mistake because it made his wound scream. "Already, there. You don't understand." She reached out and touched his face with fingers that were ice cold despite the warmth of the cathedral. "The Blackthorn Syndicate is nothing. Street thugs playing at power. I'm talking about ancient bloodlines, about clans that have ruled the night since before your civilization learned to build walls. I'm talking about becoming something that will make gods and monsters alike want you dead. You should have said no. Any sane person would have said no. But sanity was a luxury for people who weren't bleeding out in abandoned churches, and besides, there was something in her eyes, a loneliness that matched his own, a recognition that they were both creatures existing on the margins of worlds that had no place for them. Do it, he breathed. The vampire queen, though he didn't know that's what she was yet, smiled properly then, and it was like watching a rose bloom in a graveyard. My name is Seraphine Nocturne, last of the first blood, queen of the uncrowned night. And you, dying human, are about to become my greatest heresy. She didn't give him time to reconsider. In one fluid motion, she swept aside his collar and lowered her mouth to his neck. The first touch of her lips was gentle, almost reverent, and then her fangs pierced his skin and the world exploded into sensation. It wasn't pain, not exactly. It was as if every nerve ending in his body had been set ablaze, as if lightning and ice had been poured directly into his bloodstream. He tried to scream but no sound came out. His back arched, his hands clenched into fists, and somewhere in the distance he could hear his own heartbeat slowing, almost stopping. And then she pulled away, her lips stained crimson, and pressed her wrist to his mouth. "Drink," she commanded, and her voice carried the weight of centuries. "Drink and live." The blood that touched his tongue was nothing like human blood. It was liquid starlight and ancient darkness, honey and poison, ecstasy and agony distilled into fluid form. He drank because his body demanded it, because something primal in his hindbrain recognized this as salvation, even as his conscious mind rebelled against the wrongness of it. He drank until she pulled away, and then he collapsed back against the pillar, gasping. For a moment nothing happened. Then the wound in his side began to close, flesh knitting together with grotesque speed. He could feel it happening, could feel his bones realigning, his torn muscles reweaving themselves. But more than that, he could feel something else, a presence in his blood, a foreign power settling into his veins like a spider taking up residence in a new web. His skin began to glow faintly from within, a soft crimson luminescence that pulsed in rhythm with his now steadying heartbeat. What did you do to me?" he gasped. Seraphine stood, and for the first time he saw something like regret flicker across her perfect features. "I broke the oldest law of our kind," she said softly. "I shared the first blood with a human without the council's permission. I marked you as mine, and in doing so, I've painted a target on your back that will never fade." Before he could respond, the cathedral doors exploded inward. Not from the blackthorn hunters. They would have been a mercy. Instead, figures poured in from every entrance, from the broken windows, even seeming to materialize from the shadows themselves. Vampires, dozens of them, representing clans he couldn't name but whose hostility he could feel like pressure against his newly sensitive skin. They were magnificent and terrible, each one a masterpiece of predatory evolution. Some wore ancient armor from ages long past, others dressed in modern tactical gear, but all of them shared the same glowing eyes, the same aura of leashed violence. And all of them were staring at him with expressions ranging from fury to fear to something that looked disturbingly like hunger. A vampire in crimson robes stepped forward, his face hidden behind a silver mask shaped like a screaming face. "Seraphine Nocturne," his voice boomed through the cathedral, "you have committed the forbidden transfusion. You have given the first blood to an unsanctioned human. The penalty is final death for both the sire and the marked." Another vampire, this one a woman with skin like obsidian and eyes like molten gold, hissed her agreement. "The first blood is sacred. It cannot be diluted, cannot be shared with the unworthy. He must be destroyed before the transformation completes." But a third vampire, an ancient-looking man in a Victorian suit who radiated power like heat from a furnace, shook his head. "No. Look at him. The mark has already taken. Can't you feel it? He's not transforming into one of us, he's something else. Something new. We need to study him, understand what she's created before we what?" Seraphine's voice cut through the arguing like a blade. She had positioned herself between demon and the assembled clans, her posture protective and defiant. "Before you dissect him? Enslave him? Use his blood for your petty political games? I know how the clans think. I helped write the laws you're so eager to enforce. The masked vampire tilted his head. Then you know the punishment for breaking them. I know, Seraphine said, and her voice carried a weight of sorrow that seemed to age her 1,000 years in an instant. I've known since the moment I chose to save him. But I'm so tired, Mordecai. Tired of the endless politics, the stagnation, the way our kind has become a caricature of itself. We were meant to be evolution's next step, not its dead end. This human was dying for nothing, just another casualty of a world that grinds people into dust. And I looked at him and thought, what if there's another way? The cathedral fell silent. Even the storm outside seemed to hold its breath. Demon struggled to his feet, the glowing marks in his skin pulsing brighter. He could feel the power inside him now, coiled and waiting, like a beast deciding whether to sleep or strike. He didn't understand what he'd become, but he understood betrayal and he understood loyalty. She saved my life, he said, his voice stronger than it had any right to be. Whatever law she broke, whatever price needs to be paid, that's between her and you. But you want to kill me for existing? Then come try. He had no weapons, no training, and no real understanding of what he was threatening. But the vampires hesitated, and in that hesitation, Demon saw something that terrified him more than their fangs. They were afraid. Of him. Of what Seraphine had made him. The obsidian-skinned vampire snarled. He dares? He's right to dare, the Victorian vampire interrupted. Can't you sense it? The first blood isn't just in him, it's bonding with something, changing him in ways that shouldn't be possible. Seraphine, what exactly were you thinking? Seraphine's smile was sad and secretive. I was thinking that maybe prophecy isn't just myth. I was thinking that the old texts speak of a day walker, a bridge between night and day who would either save our kind or doom us. I was thinking, she paused, looking at Demon with eyes that held centuries of loneliness, that I was tired of waiting for fate and decided to make my own. The masked vampire, Mordecai, raised his hand and every vampire in the cathedral tensed. Then the ruling is made. Seraphine Nocturne, you are hereby exiled from the Night Court, stripped of title and territory. And you, human marked with stolen immortality, you are declared anathema. Every clan has the right to hunt you, to claim you, to end you. There will be no sanctuary, no mercy, no peace. You have until dawn to leave this city. After that, he gestured, and the vampires began to fade back into shadows. After that, the hunt begins. Within moments, the cathedral was empty again, just Demon and Seraphine standing amid the ruins of a faith that had failed to save either of them. The rain continued to fall, and somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed. The Blackthorn hunters would find an empty church and a mystery they'd never solve. Demon looked down at his hands, at the faint glow beneath his skin, at the wound that had completely healed. What am I now? Seraphine stepped closer, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked uncertain. Honestly? I don't know. The first blood should have killed you or turned you completely. Instead, it's done something unprecedented. You're still human, your heart beats, you breathe, you'll age. But you're also something more. Stronger, faster, harder to kill. And that mark, she gestured to his glowing skin, that mark means you're mine in the eyes of every supernatural power in existence. My property, my responsibility, my doom. Sounds romantic, Demon said, surprised that he could still find humor in the apocalypse of his life. She actually laughed, a sound like crystal bells in a crypt. Romantic? We're going to be hunted by entities that make your Blackthorn friends look like children playing with toy knives. We have no allies, no resources, and no plan. By next week, there will be a bounty on your head large enough to buy a small country. The vampire clans, the werewolf packs, the witch covens, the Church of the Eternal Sun, they'll all want you dead or captured. Your life as you knew it is over. Demon walked to the cathedral entrance and looked out at the rain-soaked city, at the lights of Nethermore twinkling in the darkness like trapped stars. Somewhere out there, the world continued its mundane rotation, ignorant of the supernatural war that had just been declared. He'd been a nobody, a bartender with debts and bad luck. Now he was something else. Something important enough to fear. My life was over 3 days ago, he said quietly. At least now I'll die interesting. Seraphine joined him at the entrance, her presence simultaneously comforting and alien. If we're going to survive, you need to understand what you're facing. The vampire clans aren't a unified force. They're dozens of ancient bloodlines, each with their own agendas, their own interpretations of the old laws. Some will want to kill you because you're an abomination. Others will want to study you to weaponize you. A few might even want to help, though their help will come with prices you can't imagine paying. Tell me about them, Demon said. If he was going to be hunted, he wanted to know his predators. And so, as the storm raged and the last hours before dawn ticked away, the vampire queen began to teach the marked human about the world that existed in the spaces between heartbeats, in the shadows that moved when no one was watching. She told him about the Mordecai clan, the enforcers of vampire law, zealots who believed in purity of bloodline above all else. She described the Shadowfen collective, vampires who'd embraced technology and modernity, who saw his transformation as a potential evolutionary breakthrough to be exploited. She spoke of the Crimson Court, political schemers who would use him as a pawn in their endless games of status and power. But most importantly, she told him about herself, about how she'd been born in an age when God still walked the earth, about how she'd watched civilizations rise and fall, about how immortality was less a gift and more a prison when everyone you could connect with crumbled to dust. She'd been a queen once, in truth not just title, ruling over an empire of night. But power bred complacency and complacency bred decay. She'd watched her kind become parasites, feeding on humanity while contributing nothing, becoming the very monsters the stories warned about. So you decided to break the rules, Demon said. To make me what? Your redemption project. Seraphine's smile was enigmatic. Maybe. Or maybe I just saw someone who deserved better than dying alone in the dark, and for the first time in centuries, I felt something other than ennui. Does my motivation matter? You're alive. I'm exiled. And now we both have to live with the consequences. The first light of dawn was beginning to stain the eastern sky purple and gold. Seraphine flinched away from it instinctively, though they were still sheltered within the cathedral. We need to move. I have a safe house on the edge of the city, but we can't stay in Nethermore. By tomorrow night, every supernatural hunter within 100 miles will converge here. Where do we go? Demon asked. Away. Far away. There are places where the old laws don't reach, where the clans have no influence. We'll find one and then, she paused, uncertainty flickering across her ancient features. Then we figure out what you've become. And more importantly, we figure out if the prophecy is real. What prophecy? Seraphine turned to face him fully, and in the growing light, he could see that her eyes held not just hunger or power, but something desperately close to hope. The prophecy that says a human marked with first blood will either unite the supernatural world or burn it to ash. The prophecy that every clan has tried to prevent for 3,000 years. The prophecy that I just dragged you into without asking. Demon should have been angry. He should have raged at her for making choices about his life, his fate, his very humanity without his consent. But looking at her, at this ancient creature who'd broken her own laws to save a stranger, he found he couldn't. They were both refugees now, both fugitives from systems that had no room for mercy or change. Then I guess we'd better make sure we're the burning kind, he said. The world could use a little cleansing fire. They left St. Mordecai's Cathedral as the sun broke over Nethermore, two figures walking into the dawn, one who should have died, one who couldn't. Behind them, in the dust and blood-stained marble, a new chapter in the ancient war between night and day had been written. And though neither of them knew it yet, the supernatural world would never be the same. The hunt had begun. The safe house was anything but safe. It occupied the third floor of a condemned apartment building in the Rust District, a part of Nethermore where the factories had died decades ago and taken the neighborhood's hope with them. Seraphine had owned the building for 70 years under various shell companies, maintaining it as one of dozens of emergency refuges scattered across the continent. The exterior was deliberately decrepit, graffitied walls, boarded windows, the kind of place even squatters avoided, but inside, behind walls reinforced with steel and inscribed with protective wards, it was a fortress. Demon collapsed onto a surprisingly comfortable couch, his body simultaneously exhausted and thrumming with alien energy. The glow beneath his skin had faded to a barely visible shimmer, but he could still feel it there, a constant reminder that he wasn't entirely human anymore. His wound had healed completely, leaving only smooth skin where the knife had punctured. Even his blood-soaked clothes seemed wrong now, artifacts from a life that had ended in that cathedral. Seraphine moved through the apartment with practiced efficiency, checking the windows, reinforcing the door wards with whispered words in languages that predated Latin. In the growing daylight filtering through blackout curtains, she looked somehow more real and less so, her perfect features taking on an otherworldly quality, as if she were a painting of a woman rather than flesh and blood. But she cast a shadow, breathed, though unnecessarily, and when she frowned at one of the ward stones, the expression was thoroughly human. "How long do we have?" Demon asked. "Here? Maybe 2 days if we're lucky." She completed her circuit and sat in a chair opposite him, her posture immaculate despite having just fled for their lives. "The clans will search the obvious places first: hotels, bus stations, known vampire territories. This place is registered to a holding company with no direct ties to me, but Mordecai is thorough. He'll find the connection eventually." Mordecai. The masked one. He seemed to be in charge. Seraphine's expression darkened. "Mordecai Ashcroft is the hierophant of the Crimson Doctrine, the closest thing our kind has to a religious authority. He believes in the old ways with a zealot's fervor, blood purity, strict hierarchies, absolute obedience to the ancient laws. He's also one of the few vampires older than me, which makes him dangerously powerful." "You seem to know him." "Personally." A pause heavy with history. "We were allies once. Before I became disillusioned with the night court stagnation, before I started questioning whether immortality was worth the price we paid. Mordecai sees my transformation of you as the ultimate betrayal, not just of vampire law, but of everything he believes makes our kind superior to humanity." Demon studied her, this creature who'd upended his entire existence. In the dim light, she looked tired, which seemed impossible for something that couldn't actually fatigue. "Why did you really do it? And don't give me the prophecy answer. What made you look at a dying stranger and decide to throw away your entire life?" Seraphine was quiet for so long that Demon thought she might not answer. Then she stood and walked to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains at the gray morning outside. "Have you ever lived so long that you forget what it means to feel? To really feel anything other than hunger and habit? I've experienced every pleasure the world offers, Demon. I've tasted wine from grapes that no longer exist, made love to emperors and artists, witnessed the birth of music and mathematics. And somewhere along the way it all became background noise. Just existing, century after century, watching humans live and die like mayflies while I remained, unchanging and unchanged." She turned to face him, and for the first time he saw vulnerability in those crimson eyes. "You were dying for the stupidest reason. A debt. A mistake. Random violence in a world full of random violence. And I looked at you and thought, here's someone who's lived maybe 30 years, barely a heartbeat compared to my existence, and he's experiencing more genuine emotion in his terror than I've felt in centuries. I envied you. Your mortality, your fear, your desperate will to survive. And I realized I had a choice. I could walk away and remain queen of nothing that matters, or I could break every rule and remember what it means to stake everything on a single decision. That's the most depressing immortality advertisement I've ever heard," Demon said, but without malice. Seraphine laughed, genuine and startled. "Fair point. I'm terrible at recruitment." A comfortable silence settled between them, the kind that emerges between people who've already weathered catastrophe together. Demon closed his eyes, trying to process the impossible new reality of his existence. He could hear things he shouldn't be able to hear: the scurry of rats in the walls, conversations from apartments 3 floors below, even the electric hum of power lines outside. His sense of smell had become almost painfully acute, cataloging the scents of old wood, dust, Seraphine's strange non-scent, like cold stone and starlight if starlight had a smell, and underneath it all, the metallic tang of his own transformed blood. "What can I do now?" he asked. "What abilities did your blood give me? That's the question, isn't it?" Seraphine sat on the arm of his couch, close but not touching. Traditional vampire transformation is well documented. You become stronger, faster, immortal but with sensitivity to sunlight and a need for blood. But you're not traditional. You're not fully vampire, not fully human. The first blood is different from normal vampire venom. It's the original strain, undiluted by generations of transmission. It's what made the first vampires before the bloodlines diversified. So I'm a prototype. Or an abomination depending on who you ask. She reached out and touched his arm where the glow had been brightest. You need to understand something. The first blood doesn't just change the body. It changes destiny. Every vampire created with first blood became a progenitor, a founder of bloodlines that shaped history. But there's only been 12 first bloods in recorded history, and I used the last of mine on you. The clans see that as theft of something sacred. Demon absorbed this. So what you're telling me is that I'm the supernatural equivalent of someone who stole the crown jewels and wore them to a dive bar. Exactly, Seraphine said, and despite everything she smiled. Except the crown jewels are fused to your skin, glowing, and making you a walking target for every power structure in the hidden world. Great. Fantastic. Love that for me. He stood up, pacing the small apartment. His body felt different, not just healed but optimized somehow. Stronger, yes, but also more coordinated, more aware. So what's the plan? We can't run forever. Eventually, someone's going to catch up, and I'm guessing vampire hunting parties don't take prisoners. Some do, actually. The Shadowfen Collective would love to study you in their laboratories. The Crimson Court would chain you up and use your blood to enhance their political pawns. The Mordecai clan would give you a trial before burning you at the stake, which I suppose is technically taking you prisoner first. Seraphine's tone was light, but her eyes were serious. Running isn't a long-term strategy, you're right about that. We need allies, resources, and most importantly, we need to understand what you're becoming. Becoming? I thought the transformation was done. The physical transformation, maybe. But first blood bonds with the soul, not just the body. Over the next weeks and months, you'll develop abilities that reflect who you are at your core. Every first blood vampire was unique. One could manipulate shadows, another could sense lies, a third could walk through walls. Your powers will manifest based on your nature, your experiences, your fundamental self. Demon considered this. So my superpowers will be, what? Mixing cocktails really well? Making poor life choices at supernatural speed. Seraphine's expression softened. You survived 3 days on the run from trained killers with no resources and a mortal wound. You had the courage to accept an unknown transformation rather than die quietly. You stood up to a cathedral full of vampires to defend someone you just met. Your powers will reflect that strength, that defiance. Trust me, whatever you become, it won't be ordinary. Before Demon could respond, Seraphine's head snapped toward the door, her entire body going rigid with predatory focus. Someone's here, she whispered. No heartbeat. Moving too quietly. Not Mordecai, the scent is different. How many? One. I think. She moved to the door with inhuman fluidity, positioning herself between Demon and whatever was approaching. Stay behind me. If this goes badly, there's a window in the bedroom that opens onto a fire escape. Run and don't look back. I'm not leaving you two. You're the valuable one now, Seraphine cut him off. I'm already exiled, already doomed. You're the one who might actually matter. So if I say run, you run. Understood. Demon wanted to argue, wanted to play the hero. But the intensity in her gaze made it clear this wasn't negotiable. He nodded reluctantly. The knock, when it came, was polite. Almost apologetic. 3 soft taps on the reinforced door, followed by a cultured voice speaking through the wood. Seraphine Nocturne. I know you're in there. I'm alone, and I'm not here on behalf of any clan. I have information you need. May I enter? Seraphine's eyes narrowed. Lysander? The very same. Are you going to let me in, or shall I continue shouting sensitive information through a door in a building where anyone might hear? Seraphine hesitated, then carefully undid the wards. The door opened to reveal a vampire who looked like he'd stepped out of a Victorian photograph. He wore an immaculate 3-piece suit in charcoal gray, complete with a pocket watch on a silver chain. His face was patrician and weathered, with the kind of lines that suggested he'd been transformed in his late 50s. But his eyes were sharp and clever, constantly assessing. Lysander Ashcroft, Seraphine said coldly. Mordecai's brother. You'll forgive me if I'm not reassured by your presence. Lysander stepped inside, his movements measured and non-threatening. He glanced at Demon with unconcealed curiosity. So it's true. The first blood mark. Remarkable. I've only seen it once before, 300 years ago, and that vampire went on to found the Silverbane dynasty. He turned back to Seraphine. My brother is many things, but he's not stupid. He knows exactly what you've created. Then why isn't he leading the hunt? Oh, he is. But not for the reasons you think. Lysander accepted Seraphine's gesture toward a chair and sat with old-world formality. Mordecai believes the prophecy is real. He's believed it for centuries. And he's absolutely terrified. Demon stepped forward despite Seraphine's protective posture. What prophecy? She mentioned something about uniting or burning, but that could mean anything. Lysander studied him with the intensity of a scientist examining a new species. The prophecy of the 13th. It appears in vampire lore, werewolf oral traditions, witch grimoires, even in some human mystical texts, though they don't understand what they're recording. The short version? 12 vampires were created with first blood and founded the 12 great clans. Each brought change, some good, some catastrophic. But the prophecy says a 13th will come, marked but not made, human but not mortal. And this 13th will judge the night. If the supernatural world has stayed true to its purpose, this Daywalker will be its greatest champion. If we've become corrupt, stagnant, parasitic, well, they'll be our extinction event. That's insane, Demon said. I'm a bartender. Yesterday my biggest concern was whether I could make rent. Now I'm supposed to be some kind of supernatural messiah or apocalypse. Destiny rarely consults our convenience, Lysander said dryly. But yes, essentially. And that's why every faction is going to want you. The clans who believe they've ruled justly will try to recruit you. Those who know they haven't will try to kill you before you can judge them. And those who are simply ambitious will try to control you, to use your power for their own ends. Seraphine had been silent, but now she spoke. Why are you telling us this, Lysander? You're not known for altruism. Because my brother plans to end this before it begins. Mordecai is gathering the clans for a conclave, the first in 2 centuries. He's going to unite them under a single purpose, finding and destroying Demon Cross before the prophecy can unfold. And Seraphine, he'll use you as bait. Lysander's expression was grave. He'll announce that anyone who delivers you to him will receive full pardon and territorial rights. He'll turn every vampire on the continent into a bounty hunter. When? The conclave convenes in 3 days at the Blackspire Citadel. But the edict goes out tomorrow night. After that, you'll have every supernatural creature with ambition or desperation hunting you. He paused. Unless you do something dramatic first. Seraphine's eyes flashed dangerously. What are you suggesting? Crash the conclave. Stand before the assembled clans and make your case. Prove that Demon isn't a threat, or better yet, prove that he's exactly the kind of threat they deserve. Force them to see what they've become. A collection of stagnant bloodlines feeding on a world they no longer understand or contribute to. Make them choose, evolve or be judged. That's suicide, Demon said. You want us to walk into a fortress full of ancient vampires who want us dead and just, what? Give a speech. Lysander smiled thinly. I want you to remind them what fear feels like. You're marked with first blood, which means you have potential they can't measure. Seraphine is the last vampire who remembers why we were given our gifts in the first place. To protect humanity from worse things in the dark, not to prey on them. Together, you represent change, and change is the only thing that can save our kind from our own decay. And what do you get out of this? Seraphine asked. Why betray your brother? Because Mordecai has become what he always hated, a tyrant maintaining order through fear rather than wisdom. He's so afraid of the prophecy that he's willing to unite the clans under fascism to prevent it. I'd rather risk the apocalypse than guarantee stagnation. Lysander stood. I've given you the information. What you do with it is your choice. But I'll say this, the world you're running from? It needs to burn. Maybe you're the fire. He left as quietly as he'd arrived, leaving Demon and Seraphine alone with an impossible decision. We can't seriously be considering this, Demon said after a long silence. It's a trap. Of course it's a trap, Seraphine agreed. The question is whether it's Lysander's trap, Mordecai's trap, or fate's trap. She walked to the window again, staring out at the dying city. I've been running from the night court's stagnation for a century. I've watched our kind become shadows of what we were meant to be. If I'm going to be hunted, I'd rather it be for trying to change things than for simply existing. So we walk into certain death on the slim chance we can shame ancient vampires into having a conscience? Do you have a better idea? Demon thought about it. He thought about his old life, pouring drinks for people who barely saw him, going home to an empty apartment, existing in the margins of a world that had no space for his dreams. He thought about Marcus, dying because he'd witnessed something he shouldn't, and how that could have been Demon if not for Seraphine's intervention. He thought about the glow in his veins, this stolen power that made him matter for the first time in his life. No, he admitted. I don't have a better idea. And that terrifies me more than the vampires do. Seraphine turned from the window, and in her eyes, he saw centuries of loneliness and a desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. Then we have 3 days to prepare you for the most important moment of your life. 3 days to turn a bartender into someone who can stand before immortal predators and make them flinch. 3 days to become the hero this prophecy expects, or the villain it deserves. No pressure, Demon muttered. None at all, Seraphine agreed, and for the first time since this nightmare began they both laughed, not because anything was funny, but because the alternative was screaming. Outside, the city went about its mundane business, ignorant of the war brewing in the shadows. But in a condemned apartment in the Rust District, a queen and her marked human began planning an impossible heist. They would steal the supernatural world's future or die trying. The clock was ticking. The clans were gathering. And somewhere in the dark, destiny sharpened its claws. Training a human marked with first blood to survive a conclave of ancient vampires was, Seraphine admitted, somewhat outside her experience. Traditional vampire fledglings had decades to master their abilities under controlled conditions. Demon had 3 days and a crash course from an exiled queen with a death wish. They started with the basics, understanding what he'd become. On the roof of the condemned building, under the cover of night, Seraphine had Demon attempt simple physical tasks. Run, jump, climb. What should have been mundane became extraordinary. His body moved with a fluid grace that bypassed conscious thought, as if his muscles had been reprogrammed by some expert choreographer. When he jumped, he cleared distances that would have been impossible before, landing with perfect balance on narrow ledges that should have sent him tumbling. When he ran, the world blurred at the edges, his perception accelerating to match his enhanced speed. You're not as strong as a full vampire, Seraphine observed, watching him scale a rusted fire escape with disturbing ease, but you're stronger than any unenhanced human. More importantly, you're faster to adapt. True vampires are locked into their transformation. Their abilities are what they are. But you're still changing, still becoming. Your body is rewriting itself in real time. Is that good or bad? Demon dropped from the fire escape, falling 3 stories and landing in a crouch that should have shattered his legs. Instead he felt barely a twinge. Unknown. The first blood is intelligent in its way, it's designed to create apex predators suited to their environment. With you, it seems to be optimizing for survival against vampires specifically. Which makes sense, given that vampires are your primary threat. Demon stood, brushing rust off his hands. They'd acquired new clothes, dark, practical, easy to move in. He looked like a character from an urban fantasy novel, which felt absurdly fitting. So I'm becoming an anti-vampire vampire? Perhaps. Or perhaps you're becoming the bridge the prophecy speaks of. Something that can exist in both worlds, human and supernatural, without fully belonging to either. Seraphine leapt from the roof, descending in a controlled fall that defied physics, landing beside him without a sound. But physical abilities are only part of survival. You need to understand vampire culture, their hierarchies, their pressure points. They returned to the safe house, and Seraphine produced a leather-bound journal so old that the pages crackled when opened. Inside, written in multiple languages and hands, was a comprehensive history of the vampire clans. Their founding, their feuds, their philosophies. The 12 clans aren't just political factions, Seraphine explained, pointing to an intricate genealogical chart. They're fundamentally different approaches to vampirism, each shaped by their first blood progenitor's nature. Understanding them is crucial if you're going to face them. She walked him through each major power. The Mordecai clan, Crimson Doctrine, believed in rigid hierarchy and blood purity. They saw vampirism as a sacred gift that must be carefully controlled, distributed only to those deemed worthy. They were the religious authority, the enforcers of old laws. Predictable but fanatical. The Night Whisper court embraced hedonism and art. They'd produced vampire poets, musicians, painters, immortals who pursued beauty and pleasure above all else. Seductive and manipulative, they traded in influence and secrets. The Shadowfen Collective had adapted to modernity, embracing technology and science. They ran corporations, invested in research, saw vampirism as the next stage of human evolution. Pragmatic and ruthless, they valued data over tradition. The Blackwater Dominion were warriors and mercenaries, vampires who'd never forgotten their predatory nature. They hired themselves out to the highest bidder, maintaining neutrality in clan politics through sheer martial superiority. Honorable in their way, but only if you understood their code. Each clan will view you differently, Seraphine said. Mordecai sees you as heresy. Night Whisper might see you as a fascinating curiosity. Shadowfen will see a specimen to study. Blackwater will measure your worth as a warrior. You need to speak to each in their own language. And what do you see me as? Demon asked. Seraphine closed the journal, her expression unreadable. Hope. Terrifying, fragile hope that change is still possible. The second night of training focused on mental discipline. Seraphine explained that vampires had subtle psychic abilities, not mind control as popular fiction suggested, but the capacity to sense emotions, project intimidation, and detect lies through minute physical tells enhanced by predatory instincts. You'll be walking into a room full of creatures who've spent centuries reading people, she said. Every breath, every heartbeat, every dilation of your pupils will tell them things about you. You need to learn control. She taught him meditation techniques that were half Eastern philosophy, half supernatural manipulation of his own biology. With concentration he could slow his heart rate to almost nothing. He could regulate his breathing to seem completely calm even while terrified. He could even suppress the glow of the first blood mark, pulling it deeper into his skin until it was nearly invisible. But why would I hide it? Demon asked during one session, his pulse barely registering while his mind raced. Isn't the mark the whole point? Proof of what I am. The mark is power, but power revealed too early is vulnerability. You need to control when and how you demonstrate what you can do. Let them underestimate you, then prove them catastrophically wrong. On the third night, they focused on the most important skill, rhetoric. You're not going to fight your way out of the conclave, Seraphine said bluntly. Even with your enhanced abilities, you're one marked human against hundreds of ancient vampires in their own fortress. Your only weapon is words. You need to make them question themselves, doubt their certainty, see you as more valuable alive than dead. They practiced for hours, Seraphine role-playing various clan leaders while Demon crafted arguments. It was exhausting and humiliating. She tore apart his logical fallacies, mocked his emotional appeals, demonstrated how every rhetorical trick could be turned against him. But slowly, painfully he began to improve. He learned to frame his existence not as a threat but as an opportunity. He learned to weaponize vampire arrogance, to make them compete for the privilege of studying him rather than uniting to destroy him. He learned to tell truths that sounded like lies and lies that sounded like truths, to build arguments that seemed logical while leading to absurd conclusions. You're getting better, Seraphine admitted as false dawn approached on the third day. You might survive the first 5 minutes. Your confidence is overwhelming. Confidence gets you killed in vampire politics. Paranoid competence might get you through alive. She paused, then did something unexpected. She reached out and took his hand. Her skin was cold, but the gesture was warm. Demon, you need to understand something. If this goes wrong, if they decide to make an example of us, I won't be able to protect you. The conclave will be held in a sanctified space, ancient ground that amplifies vampire power and limits mine specifically. I'm exiled, which means I'll be operating under restrictions the others won't face. So why are we doing this? Because the alternative is running forever and I'm tired of running. Because maybe Lysander is right and the clans need to be confronted with what they've become. Because, she hesitated, vulnerable in a way he'd never seen. Because for the first time in centuries I feel like I'm part of something that might matter. Even if it kills me. Demon squeezed her hand, this ancient creature who'd saved his life and damned him in the same breath. Then let's make it matter. The final hours before the conclave were spent in preparation of a different kind. Seraphine used her remaining resources to acquire appropriate clothing. For Demon, a suit of dark charcoal that managed to look both modern and timeless, and for herself, a gown of deep crimson that seemed woven from blood and shadow. They looked like they were dressing for a funeral, which seemed appropriate. As they prepared to leave the safe house, Demon caught his reflection in a cracked mirror. The man staring back was simultaneously familiar and strange. Same face, same features, but something in the eyes had changed. There was a hardness there now, a knowledge that couldn't be unknown. 3 days ago he'd been running from small-time criminals. Now he was about to walk into a gathering of immortal predators and demand they listen. Last chance to reconsider, Seraphine said from the doorway. Demon straightened his tie, marveling at how steady his hands were. The fear was still there, coiling in his gut like a living thing, but it was manageable now. Seraphine had been right. He'd survived too much to die quietly. I've been thinking about what you said, he told her. About why you saved me. About seeing someone who deserved better than dying for nothing. He turned from the mirror. Maybe that's the answer. Maybe that's what I'd tell them. That I'm proof that deserving matters, that mercy isn't weakness, that there's still value in saving someone for no reason other than it's the right thing to do. Seraphine's smile was sad and proud. That's either the most persuasive argument you've made, or the most naive. I suppose we'll find out which. They left the safe house as the sun set on the third day, two figures walking toward a destiny that neither fully understood. The Blackspire Citadel was a night's journey away, hidden in the mountains north of Nethermoor. It was a place where vampires had convened for millennia, where ancient laws were written and rebellions were crushed. It was sacred ground and killing ground in equal measure. And tonight, it would be the stage for the most dangerous gambit of Demon Cross's new life. As they traveled through the darkness, Seraphine told him one final truth. The prophecy speaks of a daywalker who will judge the supernatural world. But prophecies are tricky things, Demon. They describe what might be, not what must be. You're not bound by destiny, you get to choose what you become. Hero, villain, or something entirely different. The clans fear you because you represent change, but change is neutral. It's what we make of it that matters. No pressure, Demon repeated his earlier joke, but this time it felt different. This time it felt like acceptance. They reached the Blackspire Citadel as midnight approached, a fortress carved directly into the mountain itself, all dark stone and impossible architecture that predated recorded history. Torches burned with cold fire in sconces along the approach, and at the gates, vampire sentries watched with eyes that glowed like embers. One of the sentries stepped forward, a warrior in archaic armor that somehow looked functional rather than ceremonial. Seraphine Nocturne. Demon Cross. You were expected. The conclave will see you now. No turning back. No more preparation. Just a human marked with stolen immortality and a disgraced queen, walking into the heart of vampire power to demand the impossible. Demon felt the mark in his blood pulse once, as if responding to the proximity of so much supernatural power. He felt his heart steady to a rhythm that was calm, controlled, ready. Let's go judge some immortals, he whispered. Seraphine's laugh was barely audible, but her hand found his as they walked through the gates. Let's burn it all down and see what grows from the ashes. The The conclave awaited, and with it, the future of the supernatural world, or its ending. The interior of Blackspire Citadel was a monument to vampire history and vampire vanity. The walls were carved with murals depicting the founding of each clan, rendered in a style that blended ancient artistry with disturbing realism. Here, a first-blood vampire stood triumphant over a field of defeated enemies. There, another knelt before a dying human, offering the dark gift. The scenes were beautiful and horrifying in equal measure, reminders that the creatures who lived here were both saviors and monsters, depending on perspective. Vampire sentries lined the corridors, representing different clans. Each wore colors and symbols marking their allegiance. They watched Demon and Seraphine with expressions ranging from curiosity to naked hostility. No one stopped them, but the message was clear. They were permitted to enter, but not welcome. The Great Hall of Conclave was a cavern that seemed both natural and constructed, as if the mountain itself had been persuaded to form a gathering place. The ceiling arched impossibly high, disappearing into shadows that flickered with bioluminescent fungi or perhaps some vampiric equivalent. Stone seats arranged in an amphitheater formation held hundreds of vampires, the representatives of every major clan, the elders, the power brokers, the ancient ones who'd shaped supernatural history from the shadows. At the center of the hall stood a circular platform, lit by cold fire that cast no heat. This was where the accused would stand, where rebellions were judged, where Demon Cross would make his case for existence. As they entered, silence fell like a guillotine. Hundreds of glowing eyes turned toward them, and the weight of their collective attention was almost physical. Demon felt the first blood mark pulse in response, his body instinctively preparing for fight or flight. But he forced himself to walk steadily, to keep his heart rate controlled, to project the confidence that Seraphine had drilled into him. They ascended to the platform, two figures alone in a sea of predators. Mordecai Ashcroft stood from a throne-like seat positioned at the head of the amphitheater. Without his mask now, his face was revealed, aristocratic and severe, with silver hair that fell past his shoulders and eyes that burned with the intensity of absolute conviction. When he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the cavern without need for amplification. Seraphine Nocturne. You stand accused of the forbidden transfusion, sharing the first blood with an unsanctioned human in violation of laws that have stood for 3 millennia. The evidence is irrefutable. The mark glows in his very veins. He gestured toward Demon with something like disgust. You have brought corruption into our sacred bloodlines. You have created an abomination that threatens the balance we have maintained since the dawn of civilization. Have you anything to say before judgment is passed? Seraphine stepped forward, her crimson gown seeming to absorb the cold firelight. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who'd ruled when most of these vampires were still human. I have much to say, Hierophant. But first I would ask a question. When did preservation become the same as stagnation? When did the protection of tradition become more important than the purpose behind that tradition? Murmurs rippled through the assembly. Mordecai's expression hardened. You dare lecture us on purpose? You who broke the oldest law. I broke a law that has outlived its wisdom. Seraphine cut him off, and several vampires gasped at the audacity. The first blood was restricted because our progenitors feared creating rivals, feared losing control. But look at what that fear has built. She gestured to the assembled clans. How many humans have you saved in the last century? How many times have you used your power to protect the world that gave you birth? Or have you become exactly what the old stories warn about? Parasites that take and take while giving nothing back. A vampire in elaborate robes stood, her skin like polished ebony, her eyes like molten gold. Yasmin Night Whisper. Demon remembered from his studies, leader of the court that valued art and beauty. You speak of purpose, but you created this, human, without regard for consequences. The first blood is sacred not because of tradition but because of power. Every first blood vampire founded a clan that shaped history. You've given that power to someone who mixed drinks for a living. What greatness can possibly come from such common stock? This was the moment Seraphine had prepared him for. The moment when he needed to speak for himself. Demon stepped forward, and the temperature in the cavern seemed to drop. Every eye fixed on him, dissecting him, measuring him against millennia of supernatural excellence. Common stock, he repeated, his voice steady despite the terror coursing through him. You're right. I am common. I lived in an apartment that smelled like mildew. I worked long shifts for tips that barely covered rent. I had debts I couldn't pay and dreams I couldn't reach. By your standards, I'm worthless. He paused, letting that sink in. But here's what I learned in my common life. Most people are exactly like I was. Struggling, hoping, trying to matter in a world that treats them as disposable. And you know what? Not one of you has any idea what that's like anymore. He turned slowly, making eye contact with different sections of the amphitheater. You talk about your sacred bloodlines and your ancient traditions. But when was the last time any of you actually lived in the world you claim to be part of? When did you last feel fear? Experience loss? Understand what it means to be vulnerable? His voice rose, carrying power he didn't know he possessed. You're not superior to humanity, you're removed from it. And that removal has made you irrelevant. The murmurs grew louder, angry. But Mordecai raised a hand for silence. Bold words for someone standing in judgment. But words don't change the fundamental fact. You are an aberration. The prophecy speaks of a 13th first blood who will judge us, and we have decided that such judgment is not welcome. Better to end the prophecy before it can unfold. You're afraid, Demon said, and the bluntness of it shocked the assembly into silence. Not of me specifically, you're afraid of change. Afraid that maybe the world has moved on without you. Afraid that your power, your immortality, your entire existence might not matter anymore. He felt the mark pulse stronger, felt power rising in his blood like a tide. But here's the thing about prophecies. You can't stop them by force. You can only prove them right or wrong by your actions. A vampire Demon didn't recognize stood, ancient, withered, with eyes that had witnessed ages. Then prove yourself, the elder rasped. Show us this power you claim. Demonstrate that you're more than a human with stolen blood. Seraphine's hand tightened on his arm in warning. This was dangerous territory. Revealing his abilities could make him more of a threat, could provoke immediate attack. But hiding them would confirm their belief that he was weak, insignificant. Demon made his choice. He released the mental controls Seraphine had taught him, stopped suppressing the mark, stopped regulating his enhanced biology. The glow beneath his skin intensified, visible even through his clothes, pulsing in rhythm with his heart. But more than that, something else emerged. A presence, an aura that pressed against every vampire in the chamber. It wasn't power like theirs. It wasn't the cold hunger of the predator or the ancient weight of centuries lived. It was something else entirely. Potential. Raw, undefined, dangerous potential. The feeling that he was becoming something they couldn't predict, couldn't control, couldn't categorize in their ancient frameworks. And every vampire in the conclave felt it. Felt the prophecy made manifest. Felt change incarnate standing before them. I don't know what I am yet, Demon said into the stunned silence. I don't know what I'll become. But I know what I could be. I could be your bridge to a world you've lost touch with. I could be your reminder that immortality without growth is just a different kind of death. Or, he let the word hang, I could be exactly what you fear. The judgment you deserve. The change you've spent centuries preventing. Mordecai's face was a mask of barely controlled fury. You threaten us? In our own. I don't threaten, Demon interrupted. I offer choice. The same choice Seraphine gave me when I was dying. You can kill me and prove that you're exactly what the prophecy warns about, power so afraid of change that you'll murder potential itself. Or you can take a risk. Accept that maybe, just maybe, the world needs something new. Needs someone who can walk in daylight and darkness both, who understands what it means to be human and superhuman. And what would you do with such acceptance? Yasmin Nightwhisper asked, and for the first time, Demon heard genuine curiosity rather than contempt in a clan leader's voice. What would this Daywalker bring to our world? Demon thought about his answer carefully. Accountability. You've spent centuries operating in shadows, taking what you need from humanity while giving nothing back. You claim to be superior but you're parasites at best. I would change that. Make you earn your immortality. Make you prove that your existence provides value, not just takes it. Preposterous, someone shouted. We are the apex. You were the apex, Demon countered. Past tense. Now you're legacy predators in a world that's moved on. Humans have technology, organization, numbers. They could wipe you out if they truly understood what you were. Your only protection is ignorance and the fact that most of you are too insignificant to notice. Is that really the legacy you want? Hiding in the dark, hoping no one shines a light. The amphitheater erupted into argument. Some vampires called for immediate execution. Others demanded further study. A few, shockingly few but more than zero, actually seemed to be considering his words. The unified front Mordecai had been building was fracturing, and Demon could see the fury in the Hierophant's eyes. Enough. Mordecai's voice cracked like thunder. The accused has spoken. The clans will now vote. Death or continuation of judgment pending further evidence. This was it. The moment when centuries of supernatural politics would decide Demon's fate in a show of hands. He felt Seraphine beside him, her presence steady even in the face of almost certain doom. They'd known this was likely. They'd walked into this chamber expecting to die. But they'd made the clans question themselves, and that was its own kind of victory. The vote began. Clan by clan, representatives stood to declare their position. The Mordecai clan, death. Expected. The Blackwater Dominion, continuation. Surprising, apparently warrior honor valued courage. The Night Whisper Court, continuation. Yasmin had been swayed. The Shadowfen Collective, continuation. They wanted to study him. On and on it went, the tally growing closer than Mordecai had anticipated. Demon could see the Hierophant's growing alarm as his certain victory became uncertain. The vote was approaching a tie, which under conclave law would default to continuation. And then Lysander Ashcroft stood. The Ashcroft bloodline, he announced, votes for continuation. My brother has led us well for centuries, but on this matter, he is blinded by fear. This marked human represents change, yes. But change is not inherently evil. It is necessary. And if we are so fragile that one human with borrowed blood can doom us, then perhaps we deserve to be doomed. The betrayal was absolute. Mordecai's own bloodline had voted against him. The Hierophant's face twisted with rage and something that might have been hurt. You would side with heresy. I would side with survival, Lysander said calmly. True survival, not just preservation. There's a difference. The final tally was called. By a margin of 3 clans, the vote came down on continuation. Demon Cross would not be executed immediately. Instead, he would be placed under observation, his development monitored, his powers studied. He would be simultaneously prisoner and guest, threat and opportunity. It wasn't freedom. But it was life. Mordecai stood, his entire body rigid with barely contained fury. So be it. The conclave has spoken. But know this, Seraphine Nocturne and Demon Cross. You have made enemies today that will never stop hunting you. You have fractured unity that took centuries to build. And when your prophecy comes to fruition, whether it burns us or saves us, I will be there to ensure the correct interpretation is recorded. I wouldn't expect anything less, Seraphine replied. Accountability goes both ways, Hierophant. They were escorted from the platform by Blackwater warriors. Neutral parties meant to ensure their safety until proper arrangements could be made. As they walked through the corridors, Demon felt his legs trembling with delayed shock. They'd survived. Against all odds, against all expectations, they'd walked into the heart of vampire power and emerged alive. What happens now? He asked Seraphine quietly. Now the real work begins. You've bought us time, but time is all you've bought. The clans that voted for continuation will want to examine you, test you, understand what you're becoming. The ones that voted for death will look for excuses to change the verdict. And Mordecai, she paused, Mordecai will be planning something. He doesn't accept defeat gracefully. They emerged from the citadel into the cold mountain air. The stars above were brilliant and indifferent, the same stars that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the birth and death of species. Demon looked up at them and felt simultaneously insignificant and vital. He was one human in a cosmos too vast to comprehend. But he was also the 13th first blood, the daywalker, the potential judgment of the supernatural world. "I'm not wise enough for this," he said softly. Seraphine laughed, tired but genuine. "No one is. That's rather the point. Wisdom comes from mistakes, from struggling, from having to make impossible choices. You're not meant to have answers yet, you're meant to ask the right questions. And today you asked them perfectly." A carriage waited to take them to their assigned quarters, a neutral territory owned by no single clan, where they would be housed under guard. It was a gilded cage, but it was survival. As they climbed into the carriage, Demon looked back at the citadel, at the massive fortress carved from the mountain's heart. "Do you think we can actually change them?" he asked. "Or did we just delay the inevitable?" "I think," Seraphine said slowly, "that change is always inevitable. The question is whether we guide it or get crushed by it. You started something tonight, Demon. Something that can't be stopped now. Every vampire in that conclave is thinking about your words, questioning their assumptions, wondering if maybe the prophecy is right. That's not nothing. That's revolution at its earliest stage." The carriage began its journey down the mountain, carrying two revolutionaries who'd started a war with nothing but words and audacity. Behind them, in the citadel, the clans argued and plotted. Some sought to use Demon for their own purposes. Others genuinely wanted to understand what he represented. And a few, just a few, wondered if maybe, possibly, the world really had outgrown them. Mordecai Ashcroft stood alone in his private chambers, staring at ancient texts that spoke of the 13th. His brother had betrayed him. The conclave had defied him. And the prophecy he'd spent centuries trying to prevent was now in motion. But Mordecai was old, patient, and ruthless. If the clans wanted to entertain this heresy, he would let them. He would watch. Wait. And when the marked human inevitably failed, when the prophecy proved false or dangerous, Mordecai would be there to say, "I told you so," before delivering final death personally. But in a cell deep beneath the citadel, something stirred. Something that had been imprisoned there since the founding of the vampire clans, something that the ancient texts warned